The vast Pacific Ocean lay in silence. Only the soft crash of waves against steel hulls broke the stillness of the night. But hidden behind that silence was an invention so powerful, so devastating, that it would forever change naval warfare: America's 16-inch naval guns. These were not just weapons. They were titans forged in steel, capable of hurling shells the size of a small car across 20 miles of ocean, smashing through the thickest armor, leveling fortresses, and leaving nothing but fire and twisted metal in their wake. The Japanese Navy had seen battleships before. They had felt the thunder of artillery. But nothing, not even their mighty Yamato with her monstrous 18-inch guns, prepared them for the storm the Americans were about to unleash. By the early 1940s, Japan believed the Pacific belonged to them. Their fleets had swept across Asia with near invincibility. Their soldiers dug into island strongholds, daring the United States to try and take them back. But America had a weapon that turned arrogance into fear: the massive 16-inch guns mounted on Iowa-class and South Dakota-class battleships. Each shell weighed over 2,700 pounds. Each blast thundered like an earthquake, shaking the sea and rattling bones even miles away. And when those shells found their mark, entire ships could vanish in seconds. Imagine being a Japanese sailor in the dark of night, standing watch on the deck of a cruiser. You hear the distant rumble, a low growl that doesn't belong to the wind or the sea. Then, in the horizon, flashes of orange light tear across the darkness. Seconds later, the world explodes around you. Steel bends, fire erupts, men are thrown like ragdolls. That was the terror of America's 16-inch guns. And this terror was no accident. It was designed. The U.S. Navy understood one truth about war in the Pacific: control of the seas meant control of victory. Carriers ruled the skies, but it was the battleships, with their 16-inch naval guns, that brought raw, devastating firepower to the fight. Against Japanese ships, against coastal defenses, and against any force foolish enough to stand in their way, these guns turned battles into massacres. But here's where the story gets darker and far more dramatic. The Japanese didn't just fear the weapon itself. They feared what it meant. Because every time those 16-inch shells roared, it wasn't just metal crashing into steel. It was the sound of Japan's naval dominance slipping away, the sound of their empire cracking piece by piece. Before we go further into how these guns tore the Japanese Navy apart, let me ask you this: if you're fascinated by these hidden and brutal stories of World War II, if you want to uncover the shocking truths that textbooks often leave out, then don't just sit back quietly. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Because what's coming next will take you deep into the very heart of naval warfare, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it. Now, back to the war. When the first reports of the 16-inch guns reached Japanese intelligence, disbelief spread among their officers. Could the Americans really fire such massive shells with that much accuracy, even in the chaos of night battles? The answer would come soon enough, at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and later, in the battles that decided the fate of the Pacific. Every clash told the same story. Japan would advance with confidence, its destroyers and cruisers ready to shield their carriers and transports. And then, out of the darkness, America's battleships would open fire. Salvos of 16-inch shells would arc through the sky and come crashing down, devastating anything in their path. Entire squadrons were shredded before they could even react. And as the war dragged on, Japanese officers knew one grim reality. No matter how skilled their sailors were, no matter how brave their men, they could not outgun America's naval giants. But the story of the 16-inch guns is not just about metal and fire. It is about psychological warfare. Japanese sailors would whisper stories about ships being annihilated in minutes. Survivors described the sound of incoming shells as a train screaming out of the sky. The lucky ones died instantly. The unlucky ones burned, drowned, or were left stranded in seas crawling with sharks. The U.S. Navy had found the ultimate equalizer, and for Japan, every encounter with these monstrous guns was a reminder: America was coming, and nothing could stop them. This was only the beginning. The Solomon Islands, late 1942. The Pacific night was thick with humidity, the jungle groaning under the weight of cicadas. Out at sea, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound lay calm, too calm. For the Japanese, It was supposed to be another resupply run. For the Americans, it was the perfect stage to test the fury of their 16-inch naval guns. When the battleship USS Washington, armed with her 9/16-inch/45 caliber guns, took aim at the Japanese battleship Kirishima, the crew knew they were about to witness something historic. At over 20,000 yards, those monstrous guns fired, and the night split open with thunder. Each salvo hurled 2,700-pound shells into the sky, glowing arcs of destruction that rained down with unstoppable force. The Kirishima, once proud and confident, found herself shredded within minutes. Her armor cracked, her decks burned. Her crew, stunned and terrified, realized they were up against a weapon that could tear a battleship apart as if it were paper. Eyewitnesses later recalled the sea glowing orange from the inferno. Kirishima's captain tried to maneuver, tried to escape the deadly rain, but Washington's gunners were relentless. Shell after shell slammed into the Japanese ship. Bulkheads collapsed. Ammunition detonated. The Kirishima's fate was sealed. She rolled, burning, before sinking beneath the waves, another Japanese warship claimed by America's big guns. The victory sent shockwaves through Japan's navy. They had underestimated the Americans. The 16-inch guns weren't just weapons, they were executioners. And their message was clear. No ship, no matter how powerful, was safe. But Guadalcanal was only the beginning. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. Japan's once mighty navy was bleeding. But they still believed in the strength of their carriers and the skill of their pilots. The Americans, however, had something else in mind. As the largest carrier battle in history unfolded, the American battleships, positioned as guardians of the fleet, stood ready to unleash their 16-inch guns if the Japanese dared to close the distance. When Japanese ships attempted to protect their carriers, salvos of 16-inch shells roared from USS South Dakota and USS Indiana. The results were devastating. Cruisers and destroyers meant to screen the fleet were torn apart in minutes. One Japanese cruiser was hit so hard that witnesses said it disappeared into fire before breaking in half and sinking. The Americans called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for how easily Japanese planes were destroyed. But the sailors who watched the 16-inch shells tear Japanese ships into twisted wreckage had another name for it: Judgment Day at Sea. The guns not only sank ships, but also crushed morale. Survivors from Japanese vessels described the deafening roar, the blinding flashes, and the way a single hit could erase entire gun crews or vaporize a deck section. Many sailors admitted later that they felt hopeless. No matter how disciplined they were, no matter how much training they had, they could not fight back against the raw, unrelenting power of America's naval artillery. Here's the thing: war isn't only about sinking ships. It's about breaking the enemy's will to fight. And that's exactly what the 16-inch guns did. For Japanese sailors, every time those guns fired, it felt like the ocean itself was rebelling against them. Men described the incoming shells as falling meteors or iron thunderbolts from the gods. Ships didn't just sink. They were obliterated, torn apart in minutes. Survivors floated in oil-covered seas, many too terrified to even call for help, knowing the sharks circling below would finish what the Americans had started. And with every ship lost, Japan's navy grew weaker, its dominance fading like smoke. The Japanese navy entered every battle with confidence, but after Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea, something had changed. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, and America's guns were still hungry. October 1944. The waters of the Philippines churned with history's largest naval clash. The Japanese called it their decisive battle, a desperate gamble to stop America from cutting them off from vital resources. They threw everything they had left into the fight: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and kamikaze pilots. But standing in their way were the United States Navy's Titans, battleships armed with the thunderous 16-inch guns that had already carved their legend across the Pacific. The battle wasn't just another engagement. It was the endgame. Among the American fleet were giants thought long dead: USS West Virginia, USS California, and USS Tennessee. These ships had been sunk or crippled during the Japanese surprise attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941. But now, resurrected, rebuilt, and more powerful than ever, they were back for vengeance. As Japanese battleships advanced through the Surigao Strait, These resurrected warhorses waited in ambush. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had prepared a trap, a perfect crossing of the T, a maneuver where his battleships could fire broadside, unleashing the full fury of their 16-inch guns while the Japanese could only answer with forward batteries. The result was carnage. The USS West Virginia fired the first salvo, her 16-inch guns roaring with a vengeance 3 years in the making. Each shell screamed across the night sky before slamming into Japanese battleships. Within minutes, the Yamashiro, a Japanese flagship, was hammered relentlessly. Her decks exploded. Her armor cracked. Sailors ran in panic as flames devoured her hull. By dawn, the once proud Yamashiro lay beneath the waves. The Japanese had entered the Surigao Strait with hope. They left it in ruins. But the nightmare wasn't over. To the north, the Japanese still had their ultimate weapons, Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, each bristling with 9 18-inch guns. The Japanese believed these behemoths could turn the tide, but they hadn't counted on America's combination of air power and naval artillery. When Musashi entered the fray, American planes crippled her. But it was the hammering of naval gunfire, wave after wave of 16-inch shells from escorting battleships, that sealed her fate. Shells ripped open her armor, detonated her turrets, and tore through bulkheads. Sailors described the ship shuddering under the bombardment, as if even the ocean pitied her. Finally, she capsized, taking over 1,000 men with her. Yamato herself would meet her fate later in 1945, but at Leyte, the writing was already on the wall. America's guns ruled the seas. For Japanese sailors, Leyte Gulf was a nightmare unlike anything they had imagined. Survivors spoke of entire ships vanishing in explosions so massive they looked like volcanoes erupting from the ocean floor. Shells the size of small cars tore through ships, reducing steel to molten shards. One sailor recalled, "It wasn't a battle. It was slaughter. We never saw the enemy's faces. We only saw the fire." The Surigao Strait was littered with twisted wreckage, burning oil slicks, and the cries of drowning men. For America, it was vindication. For Japan, it was the death knell of their navy. The defeat at Leyte wasn't just physical. It broke the spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Commanders realized they could no longer contest America at sea. The decisive battle doctrine they had believed in for decades had crumbled. The super battleships, their pride, had fallen before the thunder of American naval power. Even Admiral Kurita, one of Japan's most seasoned leaders, admitted later that his fleet had been outmatched, outgunned, and overpowered. His retreat marked the symbolic collapse of Japanese naval supremacy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with Japan's navy shattered beyond repair. Out of 4 major engagements, the Americans had dominated each one. The 16-inch guns had proven their worth once more, not just as weapons of destruction, but as tools of history. Japan had gambled everything and lost everything. The ocean that once carried their empire's ambitions now carried only wreckage and ghosts. The war was ending. Japan's empire lay in ruins, its cities burning, its navy shattered beyond recognition. But towering above the devastation was the thunderous legacy of America's 16-inch naval guns. Weapons that had not only crushed enemy fleets, but also changed the very psychology of naval warfare. After Leyte Gulf, the massive guns turned their attention to the Japanese home islands. Battleships like the USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, and USS Missouri steamed toward enemy shores, unleashing devastation on coastal defenses, factories, and military installations. Each 16-inch shell could travel over 20 miles, carrying destruction to places that had once felt untouchable. Entire fortifications disappeared under the rain of steel. Japanese soldiers hiding in bunkers said the ground shook like an earthquake with every impact. The guns didn't just destroy, they terrorized. It was as if the ocean itself had become America's artillery platform. April 1945, the Battle of Okinawa, the last and bloodiest clash of the Pacific. American battleships formed a steel wall around the invasion fleet, their 16-inch guns spitting fire day and night. Japanese kamikazes rained from the skies, but the battleships stood firm, their guns silencing airfields, crushing coastal batteries, and breaking enemy morale before Marines even hit the beaches. It was the swan song of the battleship, their greatest and final moment of glory. Because even as these giants roared, a new age of warfare was dawning. Carriers and aircraft had already proven their dominance at Midway and Leyte. The era of battleship supremacy was fading. And yet, no one who stood on those decks, no one who heard the shattering roar of a full broadside, ever forgot the power of the 16-inch guns. The ultimate symbol came in September 1945, Tokyo Bay. As Japan surrendered, ending World War II, the ceremony took place on the deck of the USS Missouri. Standing silently nearby were her massive 16-inch guns, silent but not forgotten. They loomed above the Japanese delegation, a reminder of the destruction America's naval power had unleashed and a warning of what defiance had cost them. It was poetic. The war had begun with Japanese naval supremacy at Pearl Harbor. It ended beneath the shadows of America's 16-inch naval guns. Even after the war, the legend of these guns endured. They served again in Korea, in Vietnam, and even during the Gulf War of 1991, proof that their destructive power was timeless. But more than the steel and fire, the legacy was psychological. The Japanese had been stunned, humiliated even, by the invention and sheer dominance of these weapons. Their proud naval tradition, centuries in the making, had been broken by the thunder of American guns. In the words of one Japanese officer after the war, against those guns, there was no answer. We could only watch as our fleets disappeared. Today, those battleships are silent museums. Their guns no longer roar, their shells no longer fly, but stand before them, and you can almost hear the echo of war, the thunder that shook oceans, broke empires, and rewrote history. The 16-inch naval gun was more than just a weapon. It was a statement, a symbol of American might, a sound that signaled the end of the Japanese Empire. So now I'll ask you this. If you had been there, standing on the deck of the USS Iowa, watching those monstrous guns unleash their fury, would you have felt pride, fear, or awe? Tell me in the comments. Let's see how you imagine that moment. And if this story of power, destruction, and history shook you the way it shook the world, then do one thing. Hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe. Because we're just getting started with more untold stories from the darkest days of war. This was the tale of how America's 16-inch naval guns stunned Japan, crushed their fleets, and forever changed the course of World War II.